cold, open nitrogen monoxide music. Dead silence. His name was David, former military, 2 tours overseas. 6 years of prepping after he got home. He had a bug-out bag with 72 hours of food. He had a water filtration system. He had a generator, a shortwave radio, and 3 different evacuation routes memorized. He died on day 11, not from a bullet, not from a looter, not from starvation. He died because the dialysis clinic 12 miles from his house lost power and never got it back. He'd forgotten to prepare for the one thing that was never in his control. He had every tool for the collapse he imagined. He had nothing for the one that actually arrived. Pause. Low ambient tone begins, barely audible. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I do. I study collapses. I study what actually kills people when systems fail. Not Hollywood collapses, real ones. Bosnia. Sarajevo. The Soviet dissolution. Post-Katrina New Orleans. Buenos Aires in 2001. Syria before the entire world stopped paying attention. Some people call themselves preppers. Some call themselves survivalists. I think of myself as something else entirely. A trash panda. I know what that sounds like. Stay with me. The raccoon doesn't prepare for a specific threat. It doesn't stockpile for one scenario. It reads the environment. It scavenges overlooked value. It moves through darkness better than most creatures that rely on light. It thrives precisely because the world it lives in is messy, chaotic, and unglamorous. That is the philosophy. And today, that philosophy is going to walk you through 9 infrastructure failures that almost nobody prepares for in time. Not because the information doesn't exist, but because most people are preparing for the wrong collapse entirely. Tone deepens slightly. Before we begin, a moment of honesty. The prepping industry, and it is an industry, sells you confidence. It sells you the idea that with the right gear, the right guns, the right freeze-dried food supply, you become invulnerable. You become the hero of your own apocalypse movie. History disagrees violently. In Sarajevo, during the 1992 siege, one of the most documented urban survival situations in modern history, survivors didn't die from lack of weapons. They died from infections, from collapsed heating infrastructure, from contaminated water that ran through pipes nobody had inspected in a decade. They died from social isolation. They died from despair that followed when the systems they had spent their entire lives trusting simply ceased to function, and nobody came to fix them. This is the collapse most people are not prepared for, not the dramatic one, the quiet, systemic, grinding one. These are the 9 failures that arrive without fanfare. In order of severity. The last one is the one nobody wants to talk about. Let's begin. Failure 9. Water treatment collapse. Tone remains calm, deliberate. Think about the last time you thought about your municipal water treatment plant. You haven't. Almost nobody does. That's exactly the problem. Modern water treatment is a precision chemical and mechanical process. Chlorination, filtration, pH balancing, UV treatment in newer facilities. It requires a continuous supply of specific industrial chemicals, most of which are produced in a handful of factories and transported through fragile logistics chains. When Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans in 2005, water infrastructure failed within hours. But here's the detail that gets buried: the contamination didn't just come from flooding. It came from pressure loss in the pipes. When municipal water pressure drops below a certain threshold, the system begins to pull inward, drawing in surrounding soil, bacteria, and groundwater through microfractures in aging pipe infrastructure. Most American cities are running on pipe systems built between 1900 and 1950. When people in post-Katrina New Orleans developed gastrointestinal illness, most assumed it was from contact with floodwater. Some of it was. But some of it was from turning on a tap and trusting a system that had already been compromised from the inside. The trash panda lesson: water you cannot see is contaminated until proven otherwise. A clean-looking tap is not proof. Pressure is not proof. The only proof is filtration, treatment, and testing, in that order. Store chemical treatment tablets, not just filters. Filters fail. Tablets don't. Failure 8. Pharmaceutical and medical supply chain breakdown. The music note drops 1 frequency lower. David, from the cold open, remember him. He is not an outlier. He is a category. In Argentina's economic collapse of 2001, pharmacies across Buenos Aires ran dry within weeks. Insulin, blood pressure medication, thyroid treatments, psychiatric medications. The medications people had taken every day for decades simply vanished from shelves because the supply chains that delivered them depended on import arrangements that dissolved overnight when the currency did. People who had never considered themselves vulnerable, people who jogged, who ate carefully, who were otherwise completely healthy, discovered that they were, in fact, completely dependent on a system they had never once thought to question. The Sarajevo survivors interviewed by Selko Begovic, the physician who documented life inside the siege for years, repeatedly described medical supply failure as a more immediate killer than violence. Antibiotics ran out. Diabetics rationed insulin. Psychiatric patients stopped receiving medication, and the psychological consequences radiated outward through entire community networks. Most prepping content focuses on calories. Almost none of it focuses on the quiet, chronic medical reality of millions of people who will have a survival window measured not in days of food, but in days of medication. The Trash Panda lesson: know exactly which medications you or anyone in your immediate network requires. Research natural alternatives where they exist, understanding their limitations clearly. Build a supply buffer now while supply chains function. And understand this uncomfortable truth: for some conditions, no amount of preparation will fully close the gap. That knowledge shapes your location decisions, not just your supply decisions. Failure 7. Telecommunications blackout. Ambient tone builds almost imperceptibly. In a grid-down scenario, most people imagine they will use their radio, their satellite communicator, their mesh network device. What most people don't imagine is the psychological weight of the silence before they remember to use it. Modern humans have been conditioned at a neurological level to receive constant information, news, weather, social confirmation, emergency alerts. The moment that stream stops, not gradually, but all at once, the brain interprets it as a threat signal. Before rational planning can begin, panic fills the vacuum. This is documented. During the 2003 Northeast blackout in the United States, which lasted roughly 30 hours in most areas, emergency services were overwhelmed, not primarily by physical emergencies, but by calls from people experiencing acute anxiety, chest pain, and dissociation from the sudden absence of information. 30 hours. With full expectation that power would return. Now imagine that expectation doesn't exist. In the Soviet collapse of 1991, the breakdown of centralized communication systems created information vacuums that were immediately filled by rumor. People made catastrophically bad decisions, abandoning urban areas that were actually stabilizing, staying in rural areas that were deteriorating, because they were acting on information that was 3, 5, 10 steps removed from reality. The Trash Panda understands something most don't. In a communications blackout, your enemy is not the absence of information, it is the false information that rushes in to replace it. The discipline to act on verified facts and not on fear-circulated rumors is a survival skill nobody sells in a kit. The Trash Panda lesson: practice deliberate information fasting now. Build a habit of making decisions under information scarcity before you have to. And establish physical communication protocols with your network, check-in points, rally locations, pre-agreed signals that function without any technology whatsoever. Failure SIX fuel infrastructure collapse. A subtle bass frequency joins the ambient tone. Everything in modern civilization is, at its core, a fuel delivery problem. Food doesn't appear in stores, it arrives in trucks. Trucks run on diesel. Diesel comes from refineries connected by pipelines and shipping networks. Those networks require electricity to pump. That electricity requires natural gas. Natural gas requires pipelines. Pipelines require maintenance crews that drive to work, in vehicles that run on fuel. It is a closed loop of interdependencies so tightly wound that a fracture at any single point propagates outward in all directions simultaneously. In Venezuela's ongoing economic collapse, one of the most instructive case studies for Western observers, because Venezuela was once among the wealthiest nations in Latin America. Fuel shortages didn't just disable transportation. They cascaded. Hospitals lost generator power. Agricultural machinery stopped operating. Food production collapsed not because of drought or war, but because farmers could not get fuel to run the equipment they had. The equipment was there, the land was there, the knowledge was there, the fuel was not. People starved in a country with functional farms. The fuel failure created a food failure. The food failure created a health failure. The health failure created a social failure. Within a remarkably short window, The entire architecture of a functioning society revealed itself as an elaborate tower constructed on a single foundation. The trash panda lesson: mobility is more important than quantity of supplies in a fixed location. A smaller mobile cache that moves is more resilient than a large static one. Understand your regional fuel geography. Where are the refineries? The pipelines? The distribution points? Know the failure sequence before it begins, not while you're standing in line behind 200 other people who just realized it simultaneously. Failure 5. Sanitation system failure. Pause. Long enough to feel deliberate. This one embarrasses people, which is exactly why it kills them. In every documented urban collapse scenario, every single one, sanitation failure arrives within days and its consequences accumulate over weeks and months in ways that medical failure alone cannot address. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery. These are not historical diseases. They are not eradicated. They are managed by the continuous, invisible operation of sewage treatment infrastructure that processes human waste before it reaches water tables, waterways, and soil. In Sarajevo, the siege didn't disable the sewer system immediately. It disabled it incrementally, through damage, through power loss, through the loss of the maintenance crews who had kept it functioning for decades. As the infrastructure degraded, waterborne illness became a primary cause of death even in populations that had adequate food and relatively clean-seeming water sources. During the Black Death in medieval Europe, which killed roughly a third of the European population, the underlying enabler of transmission was not simply the pathogen. It was the complete absence of any sewage management in densely populated urban environments. People died not only from plague, but from the secondary infections and diseases that proliferated in environments where waste management had collapsed entirely. We are not as far from that possibility as modern plumbing makes us feel. The trash panda lesson: your sanitation plan is as important as your water plan, and they are inseparable. Human waste management, hand sanitation, surface decontamination. These are not afterthoughts. They are primary. A prepper who can fight but cannot manage their own biological waste is a liability to everyone around them. Failure 4. Power grid cascading failure. The tone is now noticeably present, not loud, present. The grid is not one thing. Most people imagine the power grid as a network, a web, where if one node fails, traffic reroutes around it. This is a comforting mental model. It is also incorrect. The modern electrical grid is better understood as a series of deeply interdependent systems that are designed to operate within narrow tolerances. When load or generation drifts outside those tolerances, even briefly, the system does not reroute gracefully. It sheds load, it isolates sections. And in extreme scenarios, it experiences cascading failure, where the protective isolation of one section creates overload in the next, which forces isolation of that section, which creates overload in the next. The Northeast blackout of 2003 affected 55 million people. It began with a software bug and a sagging high-voltage line in Ohio. Within minutes, automated protective systems were doing exactly what they were designed to do, and in doing so, were accelerating the collapse of the entire regional grid. The cascade moved faster than any human operator could respond to. The grid was restored within 2 days. But the 2003 event was a minor cascade. Experts in electrical infrastructure have spent decades warning about what a major cascade, triggered by extreme weather, coordinated cybernetic or significant geomagnetic storm, would look like. The answer is measured not in days. It is measured in months, potentially years. The recovery of a grid from deep infrastructure damage requires specialized equipment, transformers. In particular, that takes 12 to 18 months to manufacture under normal industrial conditions. There are not warehouses full of spare ones. The trash panda lesson: short-term power backup is a comfort measure. Long-term grid resilience requires planning for a world where power is permanently intermittent, not temporarily absent. Passive solar, wood heat, manual food processing, and manual water movement are not primitive fallbacks. They are the foundation of a system that functions regardless of the grid's status. Failure 3. Financial system collapse. The ambient tone drops lower, almost inaudible now, but felt. This is where most people's mental model breaks down entirely. Because most people, when they imagine collapse, imagine a world where money has physically disappeared, where cash is useless, where barter is the primary mode of exchange. History shows a far more insidious failure mode. In Argentina, in 2001, the financial system didn't collapse overnight. It froze. Banks instituted withdrawal limits. Then they instituted moratoriums. Then the government announced the forced conversion of dollar-denominated accounts into pesos, and then devalued the peso. People who believed their wealth was safe because it existed in a reputable financial institution watched it, reduced to a fraction of its value within weeks. This was not a primitive society. Argentina in 2001 was a sophisticated, educated, urban nation with a functioning judicial system and a recent history of economic stability. The collapse was not caused by war or natural disaster. It was caused by the same financial engineering mechanisms that exist in every modern economy today. The psychological consequence was devastating and underreported. Middle-class Argentines who had spent decades building financial security were suddenly economically indistinguishable from the poorest citizens. The social contracts they had honored, education, savings, insurance, provided no protection whatsoever. The long-term social consequence was equally underreported. Crime did not spike uniformly. Trust collapsed unevenly. Neighbors who had lived peacefully for decades divided along lines of perceived resource security. Social cohesion, the invisible infrastructure of civil society, fractured in ways that outlasted the financial crisis itself by years. The trash panda lesson: diversification of value storage is not a financial strategy. It is a survival strategy. Tangible goods, skills, community trust, and physical resilience are forms of wealth that no bank moratorium can freeze and no currency devaluation can erode. The prepper who has only physical supplies but no social capital, no network of people who will cooperate rather than compete, has built half a survival system. Failure to social trust collapse. The music is almost gone, just a thin, cold frequency. We're near the end now. And I need you to pay close attention to this one. Because this is the failure that enables all the others to become lethal. Every study of extended societal collapse arrives at the same finding: the people who survived longest, who maintained psychological stability, who avoided the worst violence and deprivation, were not the most heavily armed individuals. They were not the most isolated ones. They were the people most deeply embedded in cooperative social networks. This is consistent across every collapse scenario I have studied. Sarajevo, Rwanda, post-Soviet Eastern Europe, post-Katrina New Orleans, the Syrian Civil War. In Sarajevo, survival networks formed along the lines of pre-existing relationships. People who had maintained genuine community connections, who had accumulated social trust before the crisis, were able to exchange goods, share information, access medical care, and maintain the psychological stability necessary for long-term survival. People who had maintained superficial social connections or had deliberately isolated themselves in preparation faced the crisis alone. And here is the deeply uncomfortable finding that almost no prepping content will address directly. In extended collapse scenarios, isolated individuals with visible resources become targets, not just for opportunistic theft, but for organized, deliberate predation by groups who have understood the survival mathematics of collective action. A lone individual with a well-stocked bunker is not a survivor. They are an objective. The social trust failure is not just an emotional or philosophical concern. It is a security failure, a logistics failure, a psychological resilience failure, and a medical failure all simultaneously. The trash panda lesson: community is infrastructure. It is not optional equipment. The raccoon does not survive by hoarding alone. It survives because it reads its environment with enough intelligence to understand when cooperation is more valuable than competition. Build relationships now. Not utility relationships, genuine ones. The kind that survive pressure. The kind where people choose each other not because of what they can extract, but because trust was established before it was needed. Failure 1. The collapse of self. Complete silence, the tone is gone. Just voice. I saved this one for last. Not because it is the most dramatic, but because it is the most suppressed, the most denied, and ultimately, the most lethal. In every extended collapse study, every survivor interview, every field report, every clinical assessment conducted after the fact, the same pattern emerges. People do not break at the moment of maximum external pressure. They break when the story they have been telling themselves about the world, and about themselves within it, is revealed to be false. The man who spent decades believing that his preparation, his strength, his intelligence, And his foresight made him fundamentally different from the people around him. That man breaks harder than anyone when the collapse arrives and levels that distinction. Because the psychological architecture he built was not designed to withstand reality. It was designed to protect a particular self-image. The woman who believed that if she just stayed quiet enough, kept her head down, trusted the institutions, played by the rules, she breaks when she realizes the institutions were not reciprocal, that the contract was never real, that the systems she had placed her faith in were not designed with her survival as a priority. In the Srebrenica massacre of 1995, the single worst atrocity committed on European soil since the Second World War, survivors described the period before the violence as psychologically more damaging than many anticipated. Not the violence itself. The period of cognitive dissonance where the evidence of what was coming was visible, but the belief that systems would intervene, that something would prevent the worst outcome, that authorities would arrive, that this was not actually happening, created a paralysis that prevented action when action was still possible. This pattern is not unique to Bosnia. It is documented in every mass crisis. The belief that the worst will not happen is not a rational conclusion. It is a psychological defense mechanism, and in a real collapse, it is a lethal one. The trash panda does not operate on hope that the world will remain comfortable. It operates on the clear-eyed observation of what the world actually is, and the quiet, unhurried adaptation to that reality. This is the hardest preparation of all. It requires no gear. It requires no stockpile. It requires only the willingness to look at your own psychological architecture honestly, to identify the stories you tell, yourself that feel like strength but function as fragility, and to do the slow, unglamorous work of replacing them with something built for reality rather than comfort. Long pause. There's a dangerous rule I've never shared in a video before. Here it is. The most prepared person in any collapse scenario is not the one with the most supplies. It is the one who begins adapting first, before the consensus acknowledges what is happening, before the crowd, before the institutions, before the official emergency declarations and the televised reassurances. Because every collapse studied, without exception, follows the same cognitive timeline in its population. First, denial. Then desperate normalization. Then panic. Then violence. Then, finally, adaptation. The survivors are almost always the people who began adapting during the denial phase, when doing so felt paranoid, antisocial, even embarrassing. The price of early adaptation is social friction. You look eccentric. You look anxious. You look like someone who doesn't trust the systems that the people around you are still comfortable placing their faith in. That is the price. Pay it. The ambient tone returns, barely. One last time, the collapse doesn't kill the unprepared. It kills the overconfident. The ones who prepared for the collapse they wanted. The dramatic one. The cinematic one. The one where their specific skills and specific supplies made them specifically heroic. The trash panda survives the collapse nobody thought was coming. Because it was never preparing for a specific collapse. It was preparing for reality.